I'm Dan. I am a full-stack developer working for Kirschbaum development. We are a full-stack Laravel agency and a Laravel partner. I also co-created the Filament admin package, which is a full-stack interface framework for Laravel. And today I'm going to be talking about one of my own coding horrors, which is my presentation that requires half of it to have a working internet connection. So that's going to be, fingers crossed, very interesting. So to start off, we're going to talk about integrations. So why do we need integrations, especially when we're working in a software as a service domain? Your users all have their own different workflows, and when they're in their day-to-day job, they are often linking multiple apps together. And I think this is actually a good thing, because apps that try to do too much and combine many purpose-built apps into one often just make cheap replicas of those apps. And a lot of the core concerns that were made when those developers first made those separate apps are often lost. And that just results in a poor user experience. So I think integrations are a good thing. No one wants to be manually connecting apps together or doing manual work, copying data from one app to another. But also, it does create a lot of problems as developers, particularly with the implementation of these integrations. So the first problem we have with integrations is endless feature requests from users, because every user has their own apps that they're using in their day-to-day workflow. No one wants to have to transition to a different app just because your app is the only one that integrates with that one. And also, many users have their own workflows very differently to other users. So, for instance, one user might want to trigger a certain integration based on one event, but another user might have a completely different event that they want the same integration to work on. And that leads me on to the second problem, which is interface complexity. When you're trying to deal with all of these separate cases where users might want to integrate in many different ways, this just creates such a complex interface for them to use, and it consumes a lot of your time having to build that interface, especially if it's like drag and drop, connecting two different apps together, or even multiple apps in a chain, and also having to save those integrations as well back to your database. That's a very complex job. And the third one is that dealing with third-party APIs is often quite challenging. And it does take a lot of our time, because we're often working outside of our domain of expertise in maybe a completely different business domain. And we have to get used to that, as well as API documentation, which might not even be there, and having to learn the intricacies of those third-party APIs. So this is where a service called Zapier comes in. And I don't work for Zapier, but I've used Zapier, and at my previous job I wrote an integration with Zapier for our software as a service app. And it allowed our users to build their own integrations into our app without us having to build any more than one API for writing those interactions. So how many people have actually used Zapier? Show of hands. Okay, a few of you. And how many people have used the webhooks API for Zapier? Okay, a few. And how many of you have actually written an app that you've then published to the Zapier marketplace for then your users to use themselves? Oh, one person, nice. Okay, so that's actually what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to attempt to write an app and publish it to the Zapier marketplace so that people can then use that app to write their own integrations. Now, for anyone who hasn't seen Zapier before, I'm just going to do a quick demo of how it works when you're creating a trigger as a user. So to start off, we've got loads of apps, over 5,000 that we can choose from as a trigger. I'm going to choose GitHub, and we're going to choose an event. So something on GitHub is going to happen, and in this case, it's going to be creating a new release on an open source project. So I'm going to click the new release and specify which repository is going to trigger this release event. So I'm connected to my GitHub account there. And we're going to type in the repository, which is Filament. And when I release Filament, this workflow in Zapier is going to start. We can actually test this integration, check it's all lined up correctly by testing the trigger. And this is going to load any releases that we already have in GitHub and show us what sort of data we've already got. So GitHub's giving us all of this information about the latest release of Filament, the name of it, the URL, when it was created, draft mode, for example. And now we're going to pick what happens when that release happens. So we're actually going to send a tweet. And I've already connected the Twitter account. So I'm going to create a tweet. And I've connected Twitter. And now we're going to actually write the tweet. And we can actually concatenate in those fields from GitHub directly into our tweet. And this is all handled with the Zapier editor. We don't have to do anything. So I'm going to input the tag name there, and then add some text. And then I'm going to attach the URL to the tweet. This is all the data we have. And now we can actually see what sort of tweet would be sent. So this tweet would be sent here. The version was just released, and then the link to it. So that's just a quick demonstration on how we can use Zapier to make a very simple integration between two tools that you would obviously have to write an integration script for otherwise. Now, going back to our problems with integrations, let's see how Zapier solves these problems. So endless feature requests turn into limitless combinations. You don't have to deal with feature requests anymore because users can connect whichever app they want to your app and even make chains of many apps altogether. And you aren't making a new feature in your app just for that. All you're handling is your own integration. And instead of interface complexity, we now have a pre-built hosted UI that Zapier has built for us. And we can use this time, instead of building this UI, to actually improve our own app and make something valuable to our users that they don't have before. And thirdly, no more dealing with third-party APIs because we have individual responsibility for our own API. We're not worrying about if another API is going to release breaking changes or introduce new features that your users want to use. You just focus on your own features. And when you create a feature, you update your Zapier integration. You don't have to worry about anyone else or any of your users' other apps. And fourth one that's not listed here is when you're using the Zapier Twitter integration, you don't have to pay £42,000 a month to send a tweet. Now, this is actually how Zapier integration works. Split into main three parts, really. It's actually a Node.js application. And what happens is you create a Node.js application that is built on Zapier's CLI framework. So they'll scaffold a lot of it for you. And what this does is you upload this through the command line to Zapier, and Zapier is actually going to push that onto a AWS Lambda function. And then that is going to act as like a gateway between your Laravel app or any other app you have and Zapier. And Zapier is going to be able to interact with your app through that specialized, standardized integration that you're going to write. The first part of that is going to be OAuth. So no users want to be juggling around API tokens between multiple apps because that's just not user-friendly whatsoever. So we have an OAuth integration. In Laravel, that will be Laravel Passport. So we'll set up Laravel Passport, and we'll make sure that Zapier is able to communicate with that. Second one is REST API resources. So in your API, you're probably going to have already some controllers, but we also need an extra layer on top of those controllers to tell Zapier where those controllers are, what data to send them. If we have any input fields, then we define those in our resources inside our Zapier app. And then they get passed straight to your API when your users use your integration. And the third one is REST hooks. So REST hooks are a little bit of a complex topic. They require a little bit of explanation. The way that Zapier runs triggers usually is through basically hitting your index endpoint to gather a list of resources. And what that's going to do is Zapier is then going to store the IDs or the primary keys for those resources and check each time that API is hit if any new resources have been created in that time. And that is what would trigger your new Zapier integration. Now, there's problems with this because it creates absolutely unnecessary server load for your own API, because every 15 minutes or so, your API is going to be hit with a new Zapier request trying to see if any new resources have been made. And also, it's going to create stress on Zapier's servers. And finally, your users will be limited on how often they can actually receive this new information. So for free users of Zapier, they can actually only trigger things every 15 minutes. And that's just going to create a delay in some of their workflows. So it's actually best to use what's called REST hooks. And REST hooks are an alternative way that Zapier allows you to do this, completely optional. But the way this works is kind of an automated webhook system. So webhooks normally allow developers to copy one URL into another app. And then each time something happens in that app, it's then going to send information back to the original app. Now, something like Stripe would use this for processing payments, because when a payment's fulfilled, it's then going to tell your app that payment's been processed, and then the subscription can start, for example. But in this case, we don't want our users to be copying webhooks either. So what we can use is a REST API to actually manage those webhooks. So what Zapier will do is it's going to send a subscribe request to your app. And what that's going to do is it's going to store your webhook in your database. And each time something happens, it's then going to send that webhook to Zapier. So there's no unnecessary API requests. It only gets sent to Zapier when the user's subscribed, and also immediately. Even free users of Zapier don't need to wait for this sort of information to arrive. So this is the base of a Zapier integration. So what we're going to be doing today is building a very simple integration for a mini CRM. All it does is it just has one model. It just has a client model. And the end goal of this is going to be submitting this form here and then creating a new client within our database. It's a very simple example, but it can be used to really project this into a much bigger integration if you wanted to. So our clients table has a name, company, email, and phone. And we have a model for this as well. Now, for Zapier to actually be able to contact our local device, we're going to need to set up something to expose the local environment to the internet, which is very risky during a talk, but I'm going to attempt it. So we're going to be using BeyondCode's expose service, which basically port forwards any requests that you get from a web URL into your computer. Let's set up an alias for this. Let's run expose. And we now have our zapiercrm.com domain that we can access anywhere. And Zapier is now able to access this. So let's sign in. And we see we've got no clients. Let's create a client for me. Company. As you can see, our client's been created in the database, and we're just going to use this interface as an easy way to check if Zapier is actually going to send anything to our database in the future. So the first thing we're going to do to start our Node.js application is to actually create it within our Laravel project. Now, you could do this in a separate repository if you wanted to, but I like to keep everything together because, for example, if you're going to add a new feature to your app, you probably want to also add the Zapier endpoint to your Zapier integration as well. And that could be good to group that code together in a pull request. So let's make a new directory in our Laravel app called Zapier. And we're going to cd into that directory. Now, Zapier has a CLI tool that I mentioned, and we can use that to scaffold a new Zapier integration right from the command line. So it's going to be the Zapier command init, and we're going to use the current directory. Now, what this presents us with is a set of templates that we can choose from. Now, a lot of these are based around which type of authentication you want to use. We're going to choose Auth 2 because that is what Passport will use. So Auth 2, npm install, and this is going to install the Node.js dependencies. I did run this before the talk, so hopefully it's all cached. We don't have to spend too much time watching this. But NPM also doesn't like to do things on stage. Very shy. Let's see what it's created, because I think it's already created files for us in the Zapier directory. So we've got this index.js file. And what this is the entry point for our application. So all requests from Zapier are going to come into this. And this is going to describe to Zapier exactly how your application is structured. So your authentication methods, any resources, creates, searches, triggers. These are all the different things that your users can create inside Zapier. We're just going to focus on resources today because they kind of group all of the other ones together into an easy-to-use structure. We also do have tests. So we're not going to cover these today, but Zapier is able to generate tests for you. You can just tweak those to make sure they actually suit your application and allows you to build a more stable integration. We're going to actually start off with the authentication.js file, and this is going to describe to Zapier how it's going to interact with Laravel Passport. Zapier's integration here isn't exactly standard with Passport. You have to make a few tweaks. So let's start off with fixing the URL for this authentication server. So as you can see, we've got quite a few functions here. I'm going to close this. Quite a few functions. One of them is to get an access token from Passport. Another one is to refresh that access token. Here we have one to test the integration. So this endpoint is actually going to return information about the current user that we can then test with, and then some more information about the authentication here that we can change. So let's start by replacing this URL with our actual app URL. We've got expose, so let's copy that one. Now Passport doesn't use an OAuth access token route, it actually just has OAuth token, so we can get rid of access token. And we also want to pass in the redirect URI. So Passport knows where to redirect back to when it's finished the authentication process. The next thing we have is the test here. So I actually have an API route set up to test with, but it's in the API/me instead of just /me, so let's correct that. And also, we're going to set up the connection label for this authentication. So how this works, I'm actually going to demonstrate where this is actually used in the Zapier interface. But essentially, when Zapier is going to get the information about the current logged in user, it's going to extract something that can then identify that account from maybe others that they've signed into with your platform. So we don't have a username on our users table, so we're just going to use the email address of the currently logged in user, and this is then used to identify that account. So that's set up. We do actually have to pass some information to Zapier about our Laravel Passport. So this is usually the client ID, the client secret. And what we can do with that is create a new client in Passport using Artisan. So PHP Artisan Passport client. It's not belonging to a user. We're going to call it Zapier. And it's going to ask us where to redirect the request after authorization. So this is actually going to be generated for us through the Zapier CLI again, because the Zapier CLI is going to give us a unique URL that we can then redirect back to. First, we need to actually publish the integration so that Zapier actually knows about it. So we're just going to call it test CRM. And now we're going to push the code up that we've got already onto Zapier in the wrong directory. Nice. Let's call this test CRM 2. Zapier push. Now this is uploading all of our files up to the Lambda function I mentioned earlier. Now we can actually run the Zapier describe, which is going to tell us about the Zapier integration, actually give us the redirect URL to send the users back to. So this is the URL here. And we can just pass this straight into Passport. Let's not open that. Pass this straight back into Passport. And now it's given us a client ID and a client secret that we can then pass back to Zapier. So all Zapier integrations are actually versioned, and the default version is version 1. So we're actually going to tell Zapier about these client information using the Zapier env set command. And the first argument is the version, so version 1. And the second is going to be the key value pair that we've got here. So the client ID is 1. Don't know why you can't see that. That set the environment, uploads it to Zapier, and the client secret as well. I'm going to copy that straight from Passport. Now it's also uploaded that. So now Zapier knows everything about the authentication side. Let's now create the resource. So we have our client model, as you mentioned. We're going to actually go to Laravel for this. We're going to create a new controller that Zapier can then call. Just a very simple controller, only 2 endpoints to list the clients and to create a new client. So let's use the PHP Artisan make controller, client controller. And it's going to be an API resource controller for the model client. It should do a lot of the work for us. So the client controller here. For now, let's just return all of our clients. We are going to change this in a bit. And Zapier expects an array. We don't just use API resources or anything. It's just a plain array of our clients. And for this, we're just going to validate the information about our clients and then pass it straight to the database. So return a new client with validated information. And it's going to be the name, the email address, the phone number, and the company and not the address. And let's make these nullable and strings as well. So now we've set up our controller a little bit. Let's go back to Zapier. And we're going to create a mirror resource in our Node.js application that Zapier is then able to call. So let's go into our Zapier directory. And we can use the Zapier scaffold command, and this creates a lot of the files for us, and also a test for that Zapier resource. So Zapier scaffold, and this is going to be a resource, and we're going to call it client. Show you what this has created. So this new resources directory, and a resources directory inside the test suite. And this is another file with a collection of functions that the Zapier will then call to interact with our API. So in this case, it's just using the JSON placeholder, but we need to replace this with our own API here. So let's use the env variable again. We're going to instead replace this here. Instead of sending it to post, we're going to send it to clients and clients. This should actually be API/clients. And we need to register this route as well in Laravel. In our API file, let's make a new route API resource clients for our client controller. We can actually have a look at what Zapier is going to be sending to our API here. So at the moment, we've got our params, We aren't going to use these. This is just Zapier ensuring that the newest records come first, because that helps it with the polling situation. But we don't need to worry about that at the moment. Here we're going to define the search function. So the search function is used by Zapier if users want to connect one app to another app through our app. So for example, they might have a form submission that they want to search our database for more information about that client and then pass it to another app. So in this case, it's going to call the same API client's index route, but with some parameters here. So let's pass in the name, email, input data, email, phone number, and the company. I'm too used to getting Copilot to autocomplete everything. I'm just lazy. So that's done. And we can actually pass this also to the create. So this is actually going to come from Zapier and be sent to the same create post route here. Let's make sure that our app can actually handle these requests very simply in our index method. So instead of calling all clients, we're just going to create a new client query, and then we're going to get the clients. And we can use Laravel's when method to easily check if a request is passing a particular value and then do something to the query if that happens. So let's inject the request here. And we can use if the request has the name, then we can scope the query with the request name. Let's change this to input name, just to be more explicit. And we're going to do the same with the email address, and the phone number, and the company.
Wow.
Thank you, GitHub. So that's us done on the Laravel side pretty much. We just have to set up the rest of the Zapier resource. So at the end, this is what is exposed to Zapier. So it's just a JSON object containing some information about this resource, the name of the resource, just some UI stuff that's being presented to the user. This is what's going to be shown when the user tries to click the new client stuff. For this find client, we can actually define input fields here. So these are going to be the ones that the user can then use to then find that client. So none of these are going to be required. We just want to pass in the phone number and the company. And we can do the same for the create. So the create also has input fields, which is used by Zapier to then pass in that data to our API. This time, the name is required, but nothing else is. Here is where we define sample data. So if Zapier isn't, for some reason, able to contact our API, this is the data that's going to be presented to the user to give them a rough idea of what's going to be returned from the API and what data they have to work with, just in case our API is down, just like a fallback method. Phone number and company. GitHub doesn't know anything about indentation, so can do everything else then. And finally, the output fields. So in the user interface, we might have these input fields here, but we don't actually have any user interface labels. So here we can use the output fields array to do that. And essentially, this is just going to be user-friendly labels for our fields. So email address instead of just email. We could use phone number instead of phone, and company name instead of company, just to give them more information, even though these are the ones that are actually being sent to the app. Let me double check the expose is still working by restarting it. And what we're going to do is we're going to push this to Zapier using the Zapier push command, and this will package up all of our files, send them off to Zapier, and then hopefully we can then use this inside our Zapier account, because this is kind of a private integration now. We've uploaded it just to our account, and if we ever want it to be listed on the marketplace, that's a separate step that requires kind of verification from Zapier that your app is actually safe. Undergoes a kind of review process that takes about a week or so. You don't have to do anything in that time. Usually, it just gets sent straight through and you have no issues because the Zapier CLI is actually very good at telling you if something is wrong with the integration before it actually ever gets uploaded. So this is back up. Check it still works. Let me refresh. OK, it's still working. When we go into our Zapier dashboard, let's create a Zap. And it's our test CRM is actually now available in Zapier. And it says by invite because you can actually invite other people to test this API if you want to. What we're going to do is we're going to be submitting this Google form and hopefully get it into our database. So the trigger for this app is actually going to be Google Forms. And I've connected my Google Forms account already. So let's use a new form response trigger. Continue. I've connected this. And our form is going to be the Zapier lead form here. Now, before we test this trigger, let's just create a response in the form just to see if the test information is appearing correctly. That's sent to Google. And now we can test this trigger and see if that form response is received. Looks like it hasn't been received yet. Here we go. Form response B here. So new company, my email address, and name. Let's continue with this. And we can now connect it to our test CRM. The event here is going to be creating a new client, as we defined in our resource. Create a new client, continue. And here is where we test to see if Passport is going to play ball and actually allow us to sign into our local app from Zapier. So sign in. And this should redirect us to the default Passport authentication screen. Here we go. We can click Authorize. And our Zapier has an API token that it can then use to send those API requests on our behalf. The connection label is set to our email address, as I mentioned in the first part. Let's click Continue. And here we're just going to pass in the fields that we got straight from Google into our actions. So the name is going to be there, email address, phone number, and the company. Now this is a very basic form. Zapier has a lot of different form components that you could use. You can even do stuff like dependent selects. So if you select one thing, it then pre-populates a different select with different options. This is just a very simple example, just using text fields. So let's continue and actually test this integration. This is the data that we're going to attempt to send to our API. And hopefully, when we submit this, it's going to actually create a second client for us. So let's test this action. And Zapier will tell if something is wrong. Nothing was wrong. It says a client was sent to our CRM. Let's refresh this page. And as we can see, a new client has been created in our CRM through our Laravel API. And this is a very simple example. We could try and do it the other way around, but I found that doing demos like this, Zapier can take a little while to have new clients arrive because obviously we're using polling. So this is all I'm going to do for today. But yeah, I hope you have found a new way to do some integrations. Maybe it doesn't fit for every single use case, but you have a lot of user interaction with this. Maybe you can use Zapier. Thank you. And if you have any questions.
Yeah, are there any questions for Dan? I'm sure there are.
What are some of the usage limits you have encountered on the free plan of Zapier?
Would you mind repeating the question so everyone can hear it?
Yeah, so the question was, what sort of limits are there on the free plan of Zapier? I think it's something like 3 to 5 zaps, which doesn't sound like a lot. But if you're a user that's using this every single day, then it's probably worth the extra cost, maybe $5 or $10 a month for the Zapier plan. We can actually look at the Zapier pricing.
It's 100 a month.
Yeah. Oh, 100 a month. Okay, so 100 sends of that. 100 sends of that zap probably. Yeah, so 100 tasks and 5 zaps here. So that's the free plan, and then obviously you upgrade based on your usage.
So what's the policy on GDPR and stuff like that?
As far as I know, Zapier doesn't store any information from your app, but I think that all of that is covered within their user policy, so your users are actually signing up for whatever Zapier does with that data when they sign up for Zapier. That's not really your problem because Zapier is handling that, and the user is signing a separate agreement with Zapier to handle their data for them. Yeah.
So how does error handling work in this specific example?
Yeah. So Zapier has an integration dashboard on the developer platform site. And the integration dashboard actually gives you quite a lot of information about how your integration is being used. So there's a monitoring tab here. And what this is doing is it's showing you which sort of errors you're receiving back from your API. And it actually logs the errors sometimes. If there are 500 errors, then it should log the response and any errors. And also, Zapier will handle the support for your users. So if your users report to Zapier that something isn't working, Zapier will actually reach out and contact you about that error, describe what was happening, and actually do a lot of that communication for you. So it's quite a good system because once they've approved your app, it's more of like a working relationship with Zapier because it's like a symbiotic. You provide an app for our marketplace, we'll help you maintain it and everything. So yeah. Yes.
Does the error handling handle retries?
I believe it is configurable because in our client, this is just a Node.js app. You can install any sort of fetch library you wanted to. I'm pretty sure that the default fetch library here probably does handle retries for you, this z.request. This is a Zapier specific helper utility class here. And this should have some sort of retry function in it. But if it doesn't, you can always just import your own retries into this and handle that for yourself. You can structure a Zapier app pretty much however you like, as long as you follow a few basic rules on code quality, because they don't want to upload any code that's potentially just going to fail every single time to their platform.
Does it also, does Zapier also queue the webhooks, for example, your service is available for a while? Or?
I'm pretty sure that it will do some sort of queuing, but the specifics of that I'm not entirely sure. I'm pretty sure that if you got in contact with the Zapier team, they'd be able to sort something out like that, but I think that's probably on a case-by-case basis. I haven't encountered a period of downtime that I've had to notify Zapier about at all, so I don't know the process for that.
Have you seen they try to deliver a webhook multiple times until you gave them 200%?
I haven't encountered a failure to register a webhook, so I'm not sure about that, I'm sorry. Usually that sort of thing is caught by tests because their test suite that they give you is actually quite good at being able to hit your local API. If you set it up correctly, you can actually test it to make sure that nothing is going to be deployed to production that is going to error out like that. And even Flare, if you have a 500 error in your app, Flare is going to report that to you immediately. So you should be able to deal with that.
Maybe one last question? I don't know if there's... No?
Nope.
Okay, thank you
Great.
so much, Dan.
Cool.